Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the February 20th, 2019 Council Work Session on Accessory Dwelling Units. So I'm going to actually take just a minute to just sort of talk through the process of this meeting. We will begin with a staff presentation, sort of background, how we got to where we are. We will then go through the packet in color-coded chunks. So we'll start with green, then go to yellow, then go to red. And Alyssa will do a quick walk through each of those items. I will allow, if you need clarification, but I have the timer set for a minute, and we have 19 things to go through. So, you know, unless you really don't understand something, this is not a time for, I'll get to you, this is not a time for broad discussion or setting out opinions, because your opinions will be next. So with each one, I'm not gonna keep a queue. We'll just go around the table. So we'll look at the green first. We're looking at those as a consent calendar. You pull the ones that you want to be able to discuss in the context of the yellow group. When we get to the yellow group, again, Alyssa will go through them. I'll allow just a brief time if someone really needs clarification. Then we will go around. You either say we retain it, we remove it. If you want to retain it, you have to make a statement about why you think that is a reasonable design and siting standard. So that is all we are doing in terms of council conversation today, is just that up and down. And understanding that what we are aiming to create is a very clear list that the public can respond to. So we want the public to know exactly where you are at this moment in time, so that they can respond with clarity, keep that, retain that, amend that in the public hearing. And then we'll come back in the second round, listening to that public input. Then you will have an opportunity, hopefully it will be a shorter list, so then we'll have more time to dive into those that remain where there's really some concern and controversy around how we want to do that, okay? And did you have a question? Process question, yes, Mayor.
This is the first time hearing of our process today, and I have to say I strongly disagree with this as a specified process. A lot of the pieces that we're going to talk about today, I don't think we've had appropriate public input on yet to make the kind of decisions you're asking and essentially telling us we have to make today. I fully believe that we can get to the point of what you're suggesting, but I thought we were going to be addressing today the issues of the remand rather than going headlong into creating new policy, which I think will, perhaps the council can give me a little bit of clarity here, but I think the more we legislate, the more we open ourselves up for appeal, and that's what we're doing when we go through this part. I think there are good answers for how we can proceed that don't involve us getting this deep yet.
Thank you, Mike. So I will just say that you did receive an email that described this process exactly, and it went out on Thursday. So we did inform you, did have an opportunity to read that and follow up. Time is an issue here because each time someone files now for an ADU, that is consuming planning commission and staff. So I'm going to let Alyssa now describe where this is with respect to the remand, how we got here, or actually Emily is going to do that. So
I will take just a few minutes to kind of bring you back up to how we got here, and to kind of help the folks who are watching catch up with what you already know from talking with me privately or in executive session. For a very long time, our code has had two potential ways that a residence could be added to a lot that already has a single family dwelling on it. If someone lived in the R1 zone or in one of the special area zones, they may be able to place what we call a secondary dwelling unit, an SDU, on their property if they meet some pretty rigorous regulations for doing so. The other possible way to put another home where one exists on a lot is through what we call just a second family dwelling, and those are allowed if you meet another different set of regulations depending on the zone in R2, R3, R4, and some of the special area zones. In 2017, the legislature said, okay, all cities of certain size, of which we are, you need to allow what we call accessory dwelling units. The legislature talks about those in terms of a second single-family dwelling that's used in connection with, or that's accessory to the first one. You need to allow those anywhere in any areas where they're zoned for single family. So that's the first part of the law, and the second part of that law says, and you can subject that ADU only to regulations that are reasonable local regulations relating to siting and design. With that new law about the allowance and about the standards that you can subject these to, the council took action in 2018 and attempted to amend the code to just address the first part, where we were going to allow ADUs, to make sure that our code at least did that. So we did that, and wherever SDUs were allowed under our code, we changed those to the term ADU and allowed them, and identified 6 additional zones where ADUs should be allowed to comply with the new law. So that was R2, R3, R4, Historic, Blair, Elmira, and Agricultural Zone. Those are the 6 additional zones. For a couple of the other zones where you heard testimony that folks were not comfortable having this new use terminology added, those zones already allowed a second single-family dwelling, and we just said, okay, that meets the definition of ADU under the new law, so we believe that we've done enough there, and we're just not gonna call them ADUs, but it meets the law. That action was appealed by 8 different parties. LUBA remanded, and I'll talk to you about that. But the result of LUBA's remand is that your changes that you attempted to make in 2018 are no longer in effect. LUBA affirmed the action that you took with respect to where you allowed these second dwellings. However, most of the arguments that were made by the appellants had to do with the second part of the law that you didn't want or try to address, which was, is it a reasonable regulation related to siting and design for each of the regulations that apply to one of these uses? We argued that LUBA couldn't get to that question because the council didn't change any of those. All we did was address the allowance part. We didn't make any changes to the way we regulate these things. LUBA agreed that yes, appellants can't challenge anything that you didn't change. But LUBA said, but you did make a change by importing R1 regulations to be applied in these 6 new zones. That essentially readopted those R1 regulations, the ones that used to apply just in R1. And so with that action, you need to address whether or not those regulations are reasonable regulations related to siting and design if you in fact want to import them into these other zones. Because the city didn't take any action with respect to regulations in the other zones, so for example, the 2 zones that we left SJW and Chambers and just said we allow a second single-family dwelling, the appellant's arguments about all those standards, LUBA said, yeah, we don't have jurisdiction to look at those right now. They're gonna have to be addressed on a case-by-case basis because the city really didn't carry those forward or touch them at all. So we're not, LUBA said, sorry, we can't get to those right now. They'll have to wait. So what we learned from that is the minimum the city can do, if the city wants to go back and redo what it did to make ADUs an allowed use in those 6 additional zones and make them subject to the standards from R1, we have to go through this analysis and make findings that demonstrate why we think they are reasonable regulations related to siting and design. And if we don't think that, we need to remove them from the code or rewrite them eventually through this second process that you're planning in a way that you think does meet that standard. Until the council does this, our code is still back at 0. We haven't addressed anything in the new state law, which means that the state law specifically says it applies directly to cities now, whether they've done anything to their codes or not. So staff have to accept these applications in areas that are zoned for single-family dwellings, whether or not we have special regulations for these, apply the standards that apply in that zone, whether or not they were designed for this kind of use, make findings that we think defend every single standard, because staff lack the authority to just not apply some standards that you've put in your code. And we have already started, and I think we'll continue to get lots of appeals. So to answer your question, Councilor Clark, I certainly believe that whatever the council does to address the law will stem the vast number of appeals that I do expect to be getting until that time. I also would expect LCDC to get involved pretty soon if we don't take action on this remand. What was brought to you today is the minimum necessary to make the R1 standards apply in these 6 zones. So this is not a comprehensive review of all the regulations that apply to an ADU. That work will still need to be done. This is basically just what we do on remand, is give you the action, to tell you what it would take to put what you tried to do back in place. So with that, we can get into the substantive piece, and if Alyssa wants to do that, or.
I have 2 counselors needing clarification at this point, Alan and then Mike.
So do we need to apply the ADU provisions to all 6 of those zones, well, the other 5, because one of them's R1, or just an R1, and because they already have that second independent unit language, right? And so what's the point of adding ADU, especially if my understanding's correct, the second independent unit rules are more flexible. Nobody's going to do the ADU anyway.
Well, I'll let Alyssa get to answer that question on the substance of it, but my understanding, I mean, from a legal standpoint, do you have to? No, you don't have to take that route. That's the route that you took before. That's what we bring back to you to reenact. But if you don't, in other words, take no action, basically what you're suggesting is no action at all, then what it results in is people applying, and then all the regulations that do apply to that second single family, which is not allowed in R1. We currently allow SDUs, but not a second single family home in R1. And anytime those regulations are applied, those will potentially get appealed to LUBA to have those regulations evaluated to see whether they are reasonable regulations related to siting and design. Now, as to whether or not those are more flexible than the SDU provisions, that would be a question for Alyssa.
I think in most cases they are, in terms of height, in terms of setbacks. They don't require a number of the standards that we'll be discussing today if you were to do a second unit in, say, R2. I will say, although legally, as Emily's explained, that it makes sense that you could proceed that way, I want to put a plug in for the practical nature of why staff believes it makes more sense to actually have a line item for ADUs. And that's what, so right now, if you look in the land use code, you'll see a line for single family dwelling, but you only get 1 per lot in R1, and then you can have, multiple in the other zones. And then there's actually a line item for accessory dwellings, and those are permitted in R1. So, and then in most of the other zones, they're also listed as accessory dwellings. Most of the special area zones, it's listed as accessory dwellings. So to go that route, you're going to have some zones where they're going to be called ADUs. You're going to have some zones where they're going to be called a one-family dwelling. It gets to be a lack of consistency in the code, and it can be confusing for folks who are trying to figure out what's actually allowed on their property. I mean, the land use code is a pretty big document, and while I deal with it every day, I know that, the vast majority of homeowners or property owners or future property owners or renters, aren't familiar with the code. And so looking at it, it's a little confusing, like, wait, I look at the ADU line and it's not listed there. I mean, I know that's a simplistic explanation, but it does get confusing for folks. And then if somebody comes in with a building permit and they say, I want to do an ADU, we have no, and they could be proposing a 2,000 square foot home on the lot where there's already a 2,000 square foot home, and they can say, it's an ADU. And we'd either have to, I'm not sure what we would do with that, honestly, because at the time of building permit, we can't apply discretion. And so Emily read to you the definition of, the state definition of an ADU, and I think we've talked about this before, that it's kind of vague. So if you're looking at a permit for a house, a second house, how would you determine it's an ADU without using any discretion?
Is the distinction between an ADU and a secondary dwelling?
Well, it's a second so a second
dwelling.
one-family dwelling. So if I say, so how, I guess, even though we allow a second one-family dwelling that meets the definition, so on paper, we would allow a second one-family dwelling that meets the definition of an ADU. When I brought you plans to show you a house, I'm not sure that you'd be able to tell me if it was just a plain old second one-family dwelling, or if it was a second one-family dwelling that met the definition of an ADU. And then that starts to trigger, well, do they get the SDC exemption? How do we know? And so it starts to be kind of a practical issue.
So if we don't apply the ADU, or even if we do apply the ADU to these other zones, we'll have two standards: second one, single-family dwelling, and an ADU.
Correct.
And then it depends on
And then you can
how
choose. I mean, then a property owner
whoever
could
wants to
choose.
develop it chooses which path they want to go on.
Correct.
But since this one's more flexible, the second one,
Right.
likely they're going to do that one.
However, if you were, the transportation SDCs were reduced for ADUs. So maybe somebody in that case would choose to do an ADU and then be subject to the more restrictive standards.
So, and if we didn't add ADUs to those six, we'd just have the second unit.
Some of them, yeah.
But we could be subject to people saying, an appeal that would say ADUs need to apply to those as well. AD rules, AD.
Yeah, the state law in this case specifies that it applies directly. So anytime someone comes in, I mean, presumably, the council took action before saying the areas where we allow single-family dwellings are R1, R2, R3, the list of areas where we already allowed SDUs and and the 6 we added. So if anyone comes in and with a proposed building permit to build a second single-family dwelling on their lot, and they show us that it's going to be accessory to or used in connection with the original one, which I'm not sure how we figure that out, but we have to accept the application because the state law says we have to. And then we just look at our code and see, well, okay, which provisions apply here? The code's not designed for that, say, in the R2 zone. So we have provisions, the lot sizes, the lot minimum sizes are much bigger for that than they are for an SDU, I would say. No?
No, I mean, it's more like building height, building setbacks, building size, the differences.
So,
But yes, that person then, no matter what you call it, anytime someone applies for one of those uses, and the city applies regulations that say yes or no, or change that, or if it's this big, or applies anything like that, whatever they're applying is a local regulation that has to be reasonable and related to siting or design. And, when all of these provisions were adopted, that wasn't the state law. And so I don't know, what I would say, Counselor, is that we would want to come back to you and do this work session on those regulations then, to make sure those regulations are reasonable local regulations related to siting and design. Otherwise, it's up to staff to try to apply all of them, make that decision on a case-by-case basis, and have all these multiple appeals at LUBA, where we're trying to defend provisions that, frankly, I don't even know if under this new state law, the policymakers really want enforced.
so why wouldn't we just get rid of secondary dwelling units and have just ADUs? everywhere.
You could try that.
Okay, you got to stop. If you need a second round, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with Alan in theory and in the general scope of what I think he's trying to say, but let me ask it a different way. We did create a definitional preamble for Jefferson West Side and the other special area zone. The LUBA did not remand on that basis. It left that one alone and nobody appealed.
Right, what you said.
Well, if I could finish. So that's settled law as a method. Why in the world wouldn't we put the same preamble definitionally around what an ADU is into R2, R3, and R4? Why wouldn't we do that? It's the easiest, simplest way to go.
I think I've seen testimony about this, and it's wrong in terms of
Because?
what is settled, because it overstates, or maybe craftily and artfully doesn't exactly tell you what Luba really did, okay? Luba said to all of you, all of the zones where you allowed, that when you address the first part of the law that says you have to allow them in all these zones, you did a good job on that. We got affirmed on a fair amount of things, right? That really wasn't an issue that, it was raised, but we were told, okay, yeah, you did fine on where you allow them. And that's really all that provision did for those zones. It said, look, we do allow them here. We call them second single-family
Do allow them in 2,
homes.
3, and 4 right now.
But that's not the approach you took before. But I want to make it clear that the regulations that
forgive
are
me, Mike.
applied, even in the special area zone, if someone came in right now and said, I'd like to do an ADU in Jefferson West Side, that application would come in and we would apply the current regulations for a second single-family home. And if any, and believe me, they were all challenged in the appeal, but Luba just said we can't get to them. In that case, staff would apply them. That individual who got denied, perhaps, would take it to Luba and then challenge all those SJW regulations. Those regulations were not affirmed. We're here really about the regulations today, not the allowance.
Again, I appreciate your testimony there, but I didn't want to debate you on this. I was looking for a particular question answered, which was, would we be safe, and why wouldn't we take the safest and shortest method to do as we did previously in 2, 3, and 4? I get R1. But with 2, 3, and 4, why won't that have a similar reaction if challenged at Luba on its face legislatively for that?
You would be safe in this appeal, but my job is to look for the long run.
If I could, that's exactly my point, is that we should be safe in that. We should take this action because it makes us safe to do that while we engage in a broader community process to answer each of these questions.
All right, I'm cutting this conversation over. We're done. We are going to actually begin the process because we have an hour to go. So let's begin working our way through.
Okay. So again, as it's been mentioned, the key outcome for today, we hope, is council's input as to how the ADU standards should be treated in the remand ordinance for an upcoming public hearing. So you received an agenda item summary to help guide you through this. Attachments B through E, which was a pretty substantial chunk of it, or actually, I just want to clarify, those are really for informational purposes. Those were just to kind of, to help you with this initial conversation. And obviously, even today, I mean, you're going to continue to receive more input from a wide variety of folks. A couple of the things I just want to note is the law is not any clearer than it was when you dealt with this in 2018. So I'm sorry for that, but yeah, I cannot give you, exactly what reasonable standards related to siting and design. We don't, have that defined by the state for us. I also want to acknowledge that this isn't an easy task. Emily and I and others, took this through the filter using the definitions that are outlined in the agenda item summary, and it's not an easy thing to do. So don't be too hard on yourselves. It is a tough task, and you've got a lot of different opinions coming at you as well. And the other important thing I think it's good to say is that you're not making a final decision today. You are simply directing us of what to put in this remand ordinance so that then we can hold you can hold a public hearing and hear all of that testimony on those, particular directions. So, and then obviously after that, I mean, you have the final say locally. So you don't, based on what you hear, you want to make changes, you can. So, and I think it's obvious, as I said before, but you are going to hear from a lot of people. So attachment A, which I see some of you have out, our color-coded attachment, that's really kind of the basic, the most important part of today's conversation. And that's really a matrix that includes a summary and an initial evaluation of the 19 regulations that were raised in the LUBA appeals. So this is not a comprehensive look at all of our ADU standards. It's all of the standards that were actually raised in the appeal. And you'll see them divided out. So the first 7 are green, and those are the standards that staff believe we can make findings that they comply with Senate Bill 1051 in terms of that they're reasonably related to siting and design. And we recommend that those be retained in the land use code. And then we would need to make findings explaining how they comply with the state law. The 6 yellow items, those are the items that we're requesting your input. We think there was really some uncertainty about their relationship, whether they're related to siting or design, or whether they're reasonable, or maybe all of those things. And for those, we'll be looking for your direction, whether they should be, moved to the green category. Should we keep them in the land use code? And in that case, we need to hear your thoughts on how they're reasonable and related to siting design, or should they be removed from the land use code and moved to the red category, which leads me to the red category. And those are the six red items that we recommend removing because we're not sure that the court would actually find that they're consistent with the state law. So in the matrix, you will notice for all of them that we did attempt to identify the relationship of the item to siting or design, and also kind of provided a basis of the regulation, which would be your starting point for, thinking about whether or not that's reasonable. In some of these we felt really confident about, in others we felt it was a bit of a stretch, but it's really your decision, and you'll need to weigh in on these for any that any of the yellow ones you bump up to green or red. We'll want to talk more about those. And so what we're going to start with is the green category. So the slides are really probably more for the audience than you. They're really just a rehash of attachment A. So just wanted to point that out. And I believe the intent, as outlined in the email I sent last week, is to walk through these kind of as a consent item calendar, or consent item. So as a package, if there's any that you think need to come out of here, then those would kind of bump into our conversation about the yellow. So I'll turn it back to the mayor.
Okay, so do you want to read through these, or does council, we can just go around? Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is go around, and we're assuming this is a consent calendar, so in this round, you just say, this is an item, I want to pull this item to go into the yellow category, so then we'll discuss. And I'm going
to do what now?
Okay.
The green 1 through 7.
Green 1 through 7. Those items the staff is suggesting are consistent with the statute. It's okay to leave them in. If you disagree with that, this is your moment to say, I want to pull this item or these 2 items, and then they'll move into the yellow category, and we'll go back around. So we're just going to go.
Will we have time for comment at any point?
At this point, the only comment will be if you decide to retain something, not in this green category, but when anything that you move to the yellow category, you'll have if you want to retain it, you'll have an opportunity to say why you think it fits reasonable siting or design standards.
In the yellow category is when we can talk, but not until then.
Yeah. Okay, we're starting with Betty. Okay.
I leave Allman.
I'm okay with green. I have a question about 1 and 2, relates to the conversation we were having with Emily earlier.
Okay, do you want to move those to the yellow, or do you just have questions?
That's right.
Clarifying question.
It-
So
And I have one too.
Because it related to the conversation we were having.
Okay, all right, so we'll come back around with those questions.
I would pull number 4 and number 7.
I have questions, but I'm okay. I just want to know what they'd be changed to if we changed them, but we're not changing them, so I'm okay.
Okay, so let's go to questions. Mike, you have a question about a specific
Yeah,
one?
I have a comment, which is why I said that. Mr. Manager, you and I have had this conversation. And because I'm forced into this process, I have no choice but to come back with my own motions and my own language and see if I can get it passed at this table. I would prefer to work together with everybody on a process that adequately addresses what we need to do, but this is not the way to do it, and I don't want to do that. But the only answer left to me is bring back something that I think suffices on my own work and see if I can get it passed at the table. And that's exactly the kind of conversations we've had about what we're trying to get away from doing. So I want to go on record as saying we could have avoided this.
Okay. Alan, questions?
So that occurs later. This is just trying to get stuff onto the table to have a discussion about later. So my question relates to the conversation we're just having, which relates to why are we applying, or why don't we apply just ADUs to 1, 2, 3, 4, what are the other two, ag and, oh, the 2 special zones.
I don't understand your question.
So this applies to all our 2, 3, and 4.
Right now.
So
Number 2 does.
number 2 does.
Yes.
And number 1 applies to R1 and R2. So does that assume that we're applying the ADU rules to all of those R1, 2, 3, and 4 and the 2 other zones?
You know, in either case, it would honestly apply. It would apply if you put in ADUs as their own separate line item. It applies right now to second one-family dwellings in R2, R3, and R4.
Oh, okay. So it's not a relevant question, not relevant to whether or not we have a second single-family dwelling unit definition process at all. Which I still don't understand why we have. But
Okay, so we're,
I'm okay with leaving them in then.
okay, so we're leaving in 1, 2, oh, did you have a question, Emily? No. Okay, so we're leaving in 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, and we're pulling 4 and 7 for the yellow category. Okay, good.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I was gonna, let me cover 4 and 7 really quickly then, because that's what I'm intending to do for the yellow category. And really quick, it's not clear in your materials, and I sent a follow-up email in response to somebody, where it says university area, those were the area-specific standards that apply within the boundaries of Amazon, Fairmont, and the South University neighborhood. And then where it says all other lots, that means the rest of the city. So number 4 is outdoor trash and storage. It requires that those areas be screened from view and from adjacent properties across a fence and alley with a minimum 42-inch tall side obscuring fence that's enclosed on at least 3 sides. And the only thing I didn't see too many, I'm not sure I saw anyone who actually has this type of standard, and no other type of single-family dwelling or duplex does require trash or outdoor storage to be screened. And then 7 is the prohibition on alley access lots, and currently accessory dwellings are prohibited on alley access lots. And that's a lot that abuts an alley, doesn't have street frontage, so typically it's created from the rear portion of an existing lot. And then moving on to the 6 yellows.
Just real quick, I thought I would add in to let you know what was argued about these on the appeals. On the outdoor storage and trash, the appellants argued that it was neither a siting nor a design standard. On the prohibition on alley lots, there was an argument that it was neither siting nor design, and then also an argument that it wasn't reasonable.
Can I ask a process?
Yes.
So will we be able to hear staff's justification for why they think it meets?
You can ask at this point, as they're talking about that item, for their justification, so go for it.
So I would like to hear what staff thinks, either one of you, we would offer if we were to keep this in and got challenged, because I cannot see a justification for the outdoor storage trash as a siding and design element. We don't require it for any other dwelling units, as you just stated. And then I don't know the history of why there was a prohibition on alley access lots, so I would appreciate any perspective on that
Okay,
as well.
I can give you a little bit of information on these. We've actually required the outdoor storage screening since at least 2001 for accessory dwellings. Our best determination is that it's related to design, so you'd have to design your site accordingly, and that it addresses livability. So, I mean, having your trash screened, because you're adding an additional unit to that property, and so you want to make sure that it's not more impactful on surrounding properties. In terms of the alley access prohibition, that was added also in 2014 as part of the single-family code amendments. And one of the things about those lots is that they're typically relatively small. They're carved off the back of a lot that has alley access. If you think about where we do have alleys in Eugene, I mean, those lots, they're not particularly big. So these alley access lots are typically around 4,500 square feet. They usually aren't greater than 5,000. There's already a house typically on that lot, so adding more traffic to the alley and overcrowding concerns, you start to get more people trying to use those alleys. Most of our alleys aren't set up to have, that much traffic on them. Emily, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add.
That's what we would argue.
When I get a chance to respond to that, I will.
Mayor?
Yeah.
Thank you.
How does this relate to the measure 49 claim Morris, where it wasn't an alley access lot, it was a single-family tax lot that only had access to the alley?
So that is an alley access lot, the Measure 49 claim, the Elise Moore, that particular one. And so that was actually the first single-family dwelling on that lot. So, yeah, just one. So, and that lot is not allowed to have an accessory dwelling.
So if we keep this in, she still can't develop that?
If we keep this in, she can't have a second dwelling on that lot.
She wasn't asking for a second dwelling. She was
saying
asking
for
just, I have
first.
one lot, nothing on it, I want one house.
Right. So this would allow her to she could still do that.
This doesn't have anything to do with her.
Okay,
You still have to fix that.
All right, so go through the yellows, is that where
go
we
through
are?
the yellows,
Okay.
and then we'll,
Okay, so again, there are 6 of these. This is where we really need your input on your thoughts on whether we should retain them, and if so, how they are reasonable standards related to siding and design, and or whether or not they should be removed. So the first one is minimum lot size, and these were changed as part of the 2014 single-family code amendments. For regular lots, they were increased. The university area received its own lot standard. You need to have a minimum lot size of 7,500 square feet. You've heard a lot of comments, I think, in the input so far. There are folks who think we need to retain this because it's consistent with density. It helps protect privacy and open space. Other folks are saying, this is really a barrier and prevents ADUs on a number of lots, and it's not consistent. It's not a reasonable standard related to siding and design. One of the attachments provided in your packet was Department of Land Conservation and Development's guidance document, which it is just that. It is just guidance document. But I will note that they did not include minimum lot size standard requirements in their model code. And in fact, their guidance really recommends allowing an ADU on any legally created lot. And then one of your other attachments was about what other cities are doing. And I would just note that many of them don't have a minimum lot size, or the minimum lot size is whatever the minimum size lot you can create in the zone. So then moving to the second one, which is density. And this,
Doing these one by one?
Yeah, because it's,
yeah, let me, I'm going to let you ask a
Yeah,
question.
I would just say,
Well-
I appreciate your information about LCDC, and I appreciate your information about how some people would respond. I would respond that it's a backdoor method of redefining R1 because of the level of density. Once you change that minimum lot size, you recreate what can be sited in what place. And there couldn't be anything more fundamental to siting than what R1 is definitionally in terms of number of units per acre. So my question would be, how isn't it more accurate to say that if we have findings like I have just mentioned, that suffices for the sake of what the remand tells us, which is that we need findings in order to justify its relation to 1051?
So what Luba actually said is, normally we would take a look at this stuff. But the city didn't address it at
Yeah, I
all.
get
So
that.
if you say that, whatever you say, I mean, we can only help you along so much. Whatever you guys
I'm
want
not
to say is
asking
what
you
we'll
whether
say.
or not it wouldn't get
Luba
appealed
would
based
then-
on.
Luba would decide whether they agree or not. They want something to look at and say, we agree, we disagree.
Right. So we can use it as findings, and it is possible that someone may, based on a land use action, appeal it, but not on a legislative basis, correct?
Incorrect.
Okay? That's what I'm asking to help me understand. Why?
Because what we're asking you to do right now is do one of two things with respect to each of these. Make a finding that justifies it and leave it in, or show it as stricken from the code. Either of those things is appealable in a legislative matter. Findings are what show our legislative action is in compliance with
Right.
state law. So whatever findings you make, they look.
Well, again, it's R1. I could give a lot of other reasons. There's our shed, our climate recovery ordinance, livability, all kinds of reasons.
Okay.
Is there no other place in our code where the number of bedrooms is a design issue? That seems as clear to me as anything I can think of.
Okay. All right. Chris, you're on. Okay. So Jennifer.
Take it out.
Okay. Alan.
Keep it. I mean, if number of bedrooms isn't a design issue, what is?
Claire.
I would remove it.
I would remove it. I think it's going to be self-limiting.
Okay. All right. So that's 4 out, 3 keep. All right. Number 5, maximum occupancy.
Keep it.
Mike. Oh, you want to address why, Betty?
Climate, open space, R1, livability.
As this isn't a rationale one, I'm sorry, were you finished? I apologize. I
I'm
thought you
through.
were. As this isn't a rationale issue, but one where it specifically says that it's for council discussion and you're seeking our input, my answer is that I don't know. And I recognize where it came from, its genesis in the first place. And there may very well be a good reason for it to exist in this place as well. I don't know what that is off the top of my head until I hear from the public and more learned opinion about that. So I'm going to want to keep it until I do.
Okay. Chris.
I would take it out because I think it could be dealt with in other parts of the code. Doesn't necessarily need to be in this piece.
Okay.
Take it out.
Alan.
Keep it. I think it's a livability and overcrowding, and this issue keeps coming up over and over and over again in my neighborhoods.
I would remove it.
Okay.
I would remove it.
All right. All
How do
right.
you count couch surfers?
So that's 4 to remove it, 3 to keep it. All right, and finally, dog keeping. Betty.
Keep it, I guess, though I think there might be reasons to have more than 3 sometimes.
I need to ask staff a question on this one. So, my brand new, I have 3 dogs in my house, let's say. And
You've
my
changed.
brand new ADU has occupants with 3 dogs in that house. And because they're separate residences, are they separate isn't residence needing an address? So are they separate residences
They
technically?
are separate residences.
So because they're separate residences, is that a kennel because it's one lot?
The kennel is an establishment or premises.
So what's a premises? Is the lot a premises? 'Cause now I
Well,
have a
the
kennel.
definition also says, for the purposes of this definition, if the premise consists of a lot that contains a main dwelling and a secondary dwelling, the premise means the lot.
That would limit it.
So I say we keep it.
Well,
It's already covered.
It's covered.
No,
that means
because,
it's covered.
no, it's the other way around.
No, it's
No.
covered, because the lot would be covered. If you already have a house with three,
Premises.
that's on the lot. So-
Premises equals a house and an
Yeah.
ADU.
It's limited to 3.
License for.
My reply is still that I would like to keep it, please, because I'm not entirely sure of the logic of what just occurred, to be honest
Got it.
with you.
Okay.
I
Chris?
don't see it as either citing or design. I think it can be dealt with other parts of the code, so I'd pull it out.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, take it out.
Alan?
I take it out because it's covered.
Remove it.
Okay.
Remove it, it's per lot, not building.
All right, so that's 5-2, taking it out. Yes.
2 to 5.
And specifically in the area of the red ones, are they still going to be in the code that goes
That's what I
forward?
asked.
So they will be in the ordinance, but the ordinance shows things that are added and things that are being struck out. And I think, we'll have some kind of companion piece there too that's talking about what's being retained as well, so that's really clear. That, based on the initial direction you pointed out today, gave us today, we will be really clear about what's being retained and what's proposed at this time for removal.
Yeah, so you might say, these are still here, the public will still get to see what they are, but we could convey that the council's interest has been to remove them unless otherwise
Right.
there's a compelling
I
reason.
might add that, what we'll have is for those that are being retained, findings that explain the city's position on whether it's siting or design and its basis for determining it's reasonable. And I'm hoping that one of the things we get from a public hearing is some great ideas for defending these that maybe we didn't think about, to the extent you do want to retain them in the final ordinance. So we'll be looking for comments on the findings as well as the removals.
Okay, so for me, the purpose of going around was to just get a sense of where the council is. Okay.
Okay, Betty?
I'm concerned especially about the residence requirement. Will that not be in the proposed ordinance then for the public hearing?
It will show in the ordinance as being struck out, but it will be in the ordinance, which will give people the opportunity to comment on.
People will know that that's being,
Yeah, we'll make sure that there's a summary, kind of a cheat sheet of what you're proposing to retain, based on this conversation, what's being proposed to retain and what's being proposed to remove. So we'll have the wonky ordinance language, but I think we'll also have a more friendlier summary that will, give a higher level explanation of what's, proposed.
Molly?
So I think partly, Betty, if something's struck out and they want to keep it in, then they should still comment on that they would like to see it stay in the ordinance.
but how will they know?
It'll be clearly outlined,
It'll be struck.
It'll be here
It'll
and
be
there'll
there,
be
but
a-
it'll be.
so they'll know which way to comment if it's.
And when do we get to discuss why we want those things or
After the public.
So after the public hearing, you
Not-
will have
not now.
deliberations and action, and I imagine that will be a long meeting as well.
Emily, comments, questions?
I just have a process question as to why we weren't allowed to talk about putting the special area zone standards into this somewhat temporarily so that we couldn't be sued while we pursued Phase 2. I think that there were at least several counselors who were interested in doing that, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it.
Just, I want to address that because we do have a few minutes. To be clear, what that would mean, and it's certainly an option for the council, what that means is you would vote against the ordinance and vote essentially to do nothing. So, I mean, the words that we put in with respect to those two special zones were, and this wasn't perhaps, this is meant to defend what we did. It was semantics. It was basically just to say, hey, We already allow these here. We just call them second single-family dwellings. So, but we don't need to put that kind of language in for all the other zones. What you want to do is essentially treat all the zones like we did those ones. What we would do is just not adopt an ordinance, because we already do allow a second single-family dwelling in R2, R3, R4. It may be a question with like Elmira and Ag.
Yes.
But I'm not sure if that's a risk that you're maybe willing to take about not addressing those ones. I don't know. But, my recommendation to you, if the majority of you feels that what you want to do is treat all the zones like you did SJW and Chambers in your original action, what you really do is no action. You don't need an ordinance that says, we're good.
Then would we still be getting sued, or would?
Lots and lots.
Oh, yeah, you get sued.
No, I don't.
Not, and nobody can sue what you don't do, okay? So you wouldn't get appealed on taking no action. We would get appeals by applying the current code and on case-by-case basis as we get applications. So it would be on staff, but the council wouldn't have to do anything.
I still don't get it, since Luba already upheld those as being okay.
All Luba did was,
I mean, in the past, when we put them in, they passed.
this is a new law that passed in 2017, and it imposed a new standard that didn't apply in 2014.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mike, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. If we put the preamble in, though, and I think there are 4 votes at the table here, but the only reason I didn't make the motion is because Greg's not here, and I think we need a fuller conversation. And by the way, I hope we're going to create findings for owner occupancy, or did we just decide not to do that?
The way it is right now, the draft ordinance that will be up for a public hearing will be no findings justifying it. It would show it as.
All my colleagues are sure that's what they want to move forward with, is the staff isn't going to create any defensive findings around owner occupancy. That's how you want them to proceed. I would suggest perhaps that's not how we should, but the other piece was around Emily's question. If we did in fact put in the preamble language and then didn't do anything else, and this is just with 2, 3, and 4, how in the world can that be legislatively appealed? Because that same exact thing occurred without remand and without appeal.
I think that there's a fairly good, so it could be
And we
appealed
are,
because you'll take
and
it.
we're saying that we already do allow it, and we're not addressing standards in any way. So then there's no remand, or there's no capacity to appeal based on standards, because we're not adding them.
So, are you ready for me to answer you?
Well, I'd like you to answer the question
take a
directly,
minute.
if I could.
So, if you feel that it's important to add that preamble language for all the other zones, you would have to do that by amending the code with an ordinance, so there's an action.
Got it.
And I think that there's enough opposition out there to just sort of what it would appear to be an inaction on our part, that we would probably get an appeal, probably from the same 8 parties, and who knows. I would expect at that point, there's enough involvement that we might get some interveners to help defend the city's action as well. But I want to make it clear, the reason that Luba didn't have to remand to give us this wonderful opportunity that we've enjoyed today. And admittedly, I argued that they should do that because I thought it was important for local government to make a decision whenever we can in the first instance. But what Luba said, I don't know that they would do that the second time. What Luba said is the reach of the regulatory allowance accorded under the new law, you don't want to hear all this part, but they wanted to leave it to the cities to decide in the first instance, in large part because Senate Bill was recently enacted. There's scant legislative history for Senate Bill 1051 that assists us in resolving these questions, and there are no existing administrative rules that define or interpret its operative terms. We think the better course at this point is to remand the ordinance to have the city consider in the first instance. Now, I don't know, if you don't touch any of the other standards, again, I would argue to them, just like they did before, now they can't look at anything.
Right.
But there could be a new piece of legislation adopted between now and the appeal. There could be case law that's established by someone else. I can't tell you for sure you would get that result.
But based on what we know at the moment,
Yeah, I think if what you want to do is nothing, then you can do nothing and just maybe get an enforcement order from LCDC.
because my argument when we considered this the first time was we don't need to do anything to 2, 3, and 4 because it already allows it. That was my argument, and this council decided not to do that, and it got remanded. And I really wish we would take that course now because I think we would be safer, and we would allow people to do that. So it is what happened, Alan. It's exactly
They
what
didn't
happened.
remand it because we did it.
Yes, they did.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Emily and Alyssa, for walking us through this. Thank you, council, for your forbearance for this. And Betty, you have a comment?
If we should decide to do nothing, and I assume we still have a chance to do that, would we still have the residency requirement?
Unless or until LUBA rejects it on an application that comes through. So if we get an application in, we say, I'm sorry, no, you have told us that you're not going to live in either one of these homes. And actually, I think we have one of these going to LUBA. No, we don't yet. And then LUBA will look at that regulation, and they'll decide whether they think it's siting design or.
And do we have another opportunity when we have a full council, I don't know how it would turn out, but to discuss whether we should have findings for the residency requirement?
Yes.
Which is so crucial to preserving neighborhoods. It is.
Alan?
Well, so staff's going to go back and do this new ordinance, and for everything that we left in, they're going to put a rationale for it. Everything that we deleted or struck is going to be silent. My recommendation is that they actually say why we struck it as well, so that it's clear what the rationale for doing that is. And then people can respond to that. That just makes it clear in the public forum to be able to have a conversation about, yes, that's true or that's not true. I don't like that, I like that. And so my recommendation is for the things that we struck, that we actually do add a rationale for why we did that.
We can do that.
5 times I agree with Alan. God.
Okay. I agree. Thank you. I know this was really a challenging process and not maybe the optimal way that you each would have done this, but we did get through 19 considerations in just over an hour, and this was the way to do it. So it does enable us to just keep moving forward. So thank you very much for just hanging in there. Thank you for excellent preparation, and we are adjourned.